Okay. Hi, everyone. Just looking at the enormous list of people joining us today from all over the place and many different time zones. Very grateful that you can all join us this evening. It's a really special thing that we can share a space like this. And a few things to point out before we get started. We're recording this session and mostly so that we can make it available to those who are unable to attend this evening. And it would be greatly appreciated if you could keep your audio on mute unless you're speaking. And I encourage you to keep your video on if you're comfortable to do so, so that we can feel like we're in this space together. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please raise your hand or feel free to type it in the chat box, and I can read it or call on you when we pause for questions. And if anybody is interested in hearing more about On Empathy or looking to get involved, please send a message to the many that are involved with On Empathy, or if you can send me a message and I can help direct you. And I'm very grateful for our speaker today. And although many of us already know Andrew, I will give a brief introduction for those of us joining from outside the Waterloo Architecture community. So Andrew Levitt studied architecture at the Architectural Association in London, and also has a master's degree in counseling psychology. And so Andrew has worked as an architect and also as a union-oriented psychotherapist. Many of us know Andrew as an instructor at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, where he teaches both graduate and undergraduate design studios. He's the author of the book, The Inner Studio, A Designer's Guide to the Resources of the Psyche, and more recently, the book, Listening to Design, A Guide to the Creative Process, which was published in 2018. So I just want to quickly share my screen here. If you guys could see that. Before I hand it off to Andrew, I was looking through some of the On Empathy events from the past years, and I noticed that Andrew has presented several times since 2014. And I quickly wanted to share that because I think that it ties in and creates context for what's to be presented. And I think that a lot of these conversations took place in and around the school, and now we're sort of facing the loss of that. So thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
Thank you, Jalia. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody. On my screen, I see 4 of you. And so I thought there were just 4 people. That's why I was saying hello to the 4 of you. But of course, I now realize there's some more people here. So thank you for coming out. And Jalia, I really appreciate the invitation. The timing of it was good. And it immediately led to what I want to present this evening. Somehow the whole thing was ready to go. I just want to say one thing. I feel what Jalia reminded me that I'd presented, I don't know, 4 or 5 times before. I was a bit taken back. I'd forgotten. But I just want to explain something about why I have presented to the On Empathy platform. And it's because when I first heard that there was going to be a student-led platform called On Empathy, I was incredibly inspired. And I just felt immediately that's the revolution I want to be part of, where the kind of emotional experience of a human being is going to play a role in a school, an institution, an academy. I just felt like this is really a change that's important. So as I said, when this invitation came through from Jalia, I was excited actually, because the topic is on, I'm sure, not just my mind, but on many people's mind. And I'm just going to go through a few ideas about this. See if I can get my screen to move. Yeah. So as Jalia mentioned, the topic, COVID-19 and the loss of studio. I'm teaching a studio right now. We're all living under incredibly difficult conditions. And so I'm sharing this evening my reflections based on the things that interest me. I consider myself a student of psychology, and it's a thing that I've been interested in my whole life. So this presentation has a perspective to it, and I hope we can share our ideas in this way. So there's like 4 sections to this. The first 2 are quite brief, and we'll have opportunities for questions after each, and Jalia's run through that. Third section's a bit longer, and then finishing with the creative life. So I'm going to start with the loss of studio, power versus love, 4 positive emotions, and the creative life. So first thing I want to say is we are social animals, and there's a lot of ways to talk about public space. You can talk about it politically, you can talk about it as urban design, you could talk about it historically. Of course, architects talk about public space all the time, but I'm just going to talk about this as a social space. And my point of view is that the studio is to the school what this space is to Siena. It's a place to hang out. It's a place to meet people. It's a place you can be alone or with others. It's a magical thing, and it somehow makes everything work. It's been interesting doing student interviews. Sometimes you hear people say, if you ask someone who's not been to the school, why are you choosing Waterloo? Well, I want to go to Rome, and I love the studio. It's going to be, it's so clear that that is an absolutely unique place. And the word social, if you look it up, you know, it's an interesting word. It really goes back to the idea of unity and allies and companionship. So this kind of instinct to be with one another is not new. You know, this is deep in our souls, deep in our DNA. We come from animals that have been practicing how to be with others and the advantages of being with others. And you know, you know, even I don't know what to call the walrus when they're hanging out together. And but the idea of flocks and schools and packs, that's what we come from, and that's how important it is for all of us to be spending time in a place like a studio. And I would say for myself, even though I don't attend the studio as a student, it's an absolute highlight for me in terms of my experience of the school. So going a little deeper into this idea of what we're doing when we're together, this is a quote from Charles Darwin, talking about the expression of emotions in man and animals. And he's basically saying that sympathy is increased because communities which include the greatest number of sympathetic members flourish most, because they rear the greatest number of offspring. So this experience we're coming from has really cultivated us not only to be with one another and need one another, but it's a kind of educational experience. And that's something that's not always overt. It's a kind of covert experience. When we're in the studio, we're actually learning a lot about social life. And, you know, this is sometimes referred to as pro-social behavior. Voluntary behavior intended to benefit one another. We don't have a police force in the studio. We don't need one. People somehow understand the benefit, and they understand the benefit of helping, sharing, donating, cooperating, volunteering. This is, to me, the kind of secret value. Even though we're in studio working on a project, we're actually developing something more profound. These actions may be motivated by empathy and by concern about the welfare and rights of others, as well as for egotistic or practical concerns. But the evidence suggests that pro-social behavior is central to the well-being of social groups. Pro-social behavior is central to the well-being of social groups across a range of scales. And empathy is one of the things that I think is learned through being in studio. So when I look at spaces like this, I'm immediately thinking this is a pro-social space. It's a kind of classroom, just like the studio. And you can see the birds are there with their companions. Humans are there in their groups, whether they're individuals, couples, classes, families. And the people who run the cafe understand totally how we want to be in this space. Similarly, we lay out our desks in studio, and we have our neighbors, and we learn how to behave in a pro-social way through the use of studio. All of this rests on an incredibly complex, part of our brain that's developed. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. My favorite fact about mirror neurons is the Italians discovered this. They discovered that when you're with somebody and they perform an action, that action is actually performed in your brain. There's neural circuitry that actually repeats that. And so we're both learning and experiencing about others voluntarily, you could say, and involuntarily. There's a simulation that goes on both physically and emotionally. So we're totally wired for connection. And this is why I want to bring animals into the story. This is not new. This is a deep, deep stream in all of us. And so with this comes something kind of, less discussed, which is emotions are contagious. When the mood in studio is good, or in your row or your neighbor, you're going to have the experience of others. And, it's an incredible feeling to be around people who share the experience you're having. So on the emotional level, the whole experience of empathy is born by mirror neurons, where we experience the emotions of others unconsciously or consciously. So this is the kind of setting that, we've lost. And from my perspective, we also have to bring in one other loss, which is that studio is a rite of passage. And by that, I mean, we begin studio when we're fresh out of our family's home, and we've not yet made our own home. We've not yet discovered the kind of home we want. And I would say studio is a home. And of course, we live in an apartment, even if the days are long at studio, but it's a really significant place for all of us, because we're growing there, and we're growing from the place we came from, to a new place. And that's an unknown, but we're not having to do it alone. We're in studio. So from my perspective, I want to say something about suffering the loss of studio consciously. It's a very significant loss. And I think the primary way to meet that loss is to consciously be with the experience of that loss. In other words, you may, if you are not in studio, be feeling more anxiety, be feeling lost, or having your emotions go up and down far more than they normally would. And I would say this is a suffering that's come from the loss of studio. And our kind of antidote on one level is to suffer this loss consciously. And by that I mean be willing, and this is an act of courage really, to admit that whatever state we're going through is to be honored. That's where we are. Avoiding that state or pushing it away is making it actually amplify. That would be a kind of psychological view, I would say, that we have to meet that loss in the present. And then we have options, and that may involve bringing that experience to other people, learning something about ourselves, making a priority of valuing the emotional state we're in. And it's a difficult thing to do because, you know, we're under pressure sometimes to not honor these experiences or to dismiss them. We may have a kind of bias that says, I shouldn't be experiencing these things. But I would say studio can continue to be of benefit even though we don't attend the studio if we honor the emotions we're going through. And, you know, this is a big project. We don't know when studio will return. Currently, we're online to the end of next term. And nobody can tell us. There's a great deal of uncertainty when studio will reopen. And I'm not here as an expert or passing on good news or bad news, but it could be a year. It could be more. I don't know. But we can suffer the loss of it consciously. And I think the last point I want to make about suffering the loss consciously is that if you go through that process, you will be able to help others do the same. And that's something that you can't do if you avoid the experience you're having. I'm just going to finish this section talking a quote from Brene Brown. Connection is why we are here. It is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. So even though it's easy to get obsessed when we're working in studio on our projects, on our grades, you know, all the things going on in our life, this point for me is the key one. Connection is why we're here. Even though we may be trying to achieve amazing academic outcomes, connection is why we are here. We don't realize it until it's not with us, until it's not available. But it is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. So each little section, I want to raise a few sources if anyone wants to go further. You know, the Age of Empathy takes you into the work of Frans de Waal, who works with animals and is examining their inclination to cooperate. Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Kimmerer's great book where she discusses the covenant of reciprocity. And you get the sense that we would be helped by understanding the importance of our place in the whole world of living things. Again, studio is a place where we're in a version of that world. And then The Hidden Life of Trees, I'm sure some of you have seen it, but even trees, in a sense, a forest is a studio. A forest is a community of species that are behaving in a pro-social fashion. A moment's pause here, which is either an opportunity for questions, reflections. chance to do whatever you need to do. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jalia, and see if we have anything or anyone wants to comment.
Maybe we can open up for questions for a moment. I don't see any questions in the chat box yet.
It's fine. I'm happy to carry on, and we can pick up questions as we go. One thing I've noticed, and this is something that I've seen in many places, that, you know, there's something about talking about emotions that is more difficult. And this is one of I think one of the great things that I hope is going to be transformed by the suffering of COVID-19, is that the emotional world is going to be more valued and more central to our capacity to communicate with one another. There was an interesting quote by Brene Brown. She said, "We think we're rational people who have occasional emotional experiences." She says, we're emotional people who occasionally have rational experiences.
Andrew, I think there's a question. I may just read that. That's okay.
Sure.
It's from Wanjiku. And the question is, for those of us who haven't quite lost studio yet because we are just joining this field, is mourning something you don't have but expect somewhat different?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's very true. As we go through this presentation, I'm going to bring up some resources that I think would support that question a bit. But I would say that the fundamental truth may be that there's no loss yet. But certainly the process of going to university, even if it's you know, with an online community, has challenges. In a way, that's the purpose of the journey. You know, we're going to have these challenges. So whether it's the loss of studio or whatever arises, my experience is that no one is free of opportunities for learning from their experience. So I would put it in that context right now. It's a big step. And so the same point would apply, a kind of honesty. Self-reflection is difficult because it's painful. And so it's not really a subject taught in school. One has to have a certain motivation to take that on. But I would say at times like this, where we are in a difficult circumstance, self-reflection is a way of thinking about suffering consciously. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit here about power versus love. And by this, I'm talking about the abuse of power. And I'm touching on this because, you know, we've been going through in parallel with COVID-19, you know, a light has been shining on the catastrophe of the abuse of power that's around us. And I think there's many reasons why this is so highlighted. One of them is that there's death in the air. It's actually quite a dangerous time to take on certain activities. And we don't generally have that in our world. As one author said, you know, the stars aren't in the sky, they're in Hollywood. We're very distracted. And now something's happened that asks for self-reflection. And so the abuse of power has come up, and it's something I want to speak to because certainly when you work as a therapist, you encounter this. I'm not talking about something that just started. I'm talking about something that's always existed. It's not 100 years, it's not 500, it's throughout, I think, the history of humankind, there's been the abuse of power, and at all scales. It's not just, a country that may abuse power. Power is abused by corporations. Power is abused by religious institutions, educational institutions. Uh, it can be abused in a classroom. You can get bullying in a classroom. So even a family, you will find, tragically, catastrophically, there can be an abuse of power. And so one view of this is, what's wrong with society? But my experience after studying psychology is, this is something that the individual has to also look into. And, Carl Jung was a therapist who inspired me when I initially took an interest. And this is a quote of his, maybe now 60 years old: "Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, there love is lacking." And he begins to tease apart how these two forces never seem to come together. And quite beautifully, 30 years ago, Martin Luther King evolved that idea. He said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." So from my perspective, power needs love and love needs power. And we have a very big challenge in front of us, both as individuals, and from my perspective, the work of the individual is to examine this. But at every level, how are these two going to communicate? This is a very big challenge. It's every generation's job, I would say, to bring forward the injustices, the abuses of power. You're called a generation because you're supposed to generate something. And so every generation points out what the previous generation had a blind spot towards. But my concern always is that how we change is just as important as what we change. Otherwise, the canon is just replaced by something slightly more refined, but not necessarily greater engagement between power and love. This to me is an issue of emotional literacy. And I'm not speaking about institutions at all here. It's so fascinating to me that many of the difficulties a human being has, they're not trained to deal with. And our whole system is often skewed towards, acquiring a kind of knowledge that may not really help us when we're feeling like our resources are low. So I'm just mentioning 4 texts here. Emotional intelligence was a sort of breakthrough because it became very popular. And he pointed out, Goleman points out things that we now understand, that a high scholastic average does not guarantee happiness. It doesn't even guarantee income. He points out that emotional intelligence is a much better marker of a capacity to be happy and successful. Why? Because people like your energy. They're not afraid of you. They want to be with you. And then he wrote a book 25 years later where he realized emotional intelligence was just for the individual. Social intelligence is talking about relationships. And, what a topic to bring to our schools. we're expected somehow to navigate the world without any emotional literacy except what we pick up on the go. And the beautiful thing about the last 100 years from my perspective is psychology is digging into these things and scientifically trying to understand them. That is through evidence-based practices. The work of Brene Brown is, some of you may know through YouTube. All of these people I've mentioned are quite popular. But you know, I think what she's most remarkably put across to a large audience is the need to be vulnerable. And that vulnerability, far from being something that diminishes us, is the source of courage, relational life, a rich relational life. And so I'm not going to say more about it, but if you have an interest in hearing an expert talk about vulnerability, please tune into that. And then finally, the work of Adam Kahane, who is a Canadian born in Montreal. His professional work is based on how to get adversarial partnerships into dialogue. And you know, he made a point that really impressed me. He was at a conference, a World Climate Conference in Copenhagen, trying to facilitate some kind of communication between CEOs of large oil companies and people from Greenpeace. And he realized that both parties were convinced their position was correct. And there was, even though you might stand back and say, this one's power, this one's love, both had, in a way, the similar experience where surrendering or listening was a complete challenge. So his subtitle, How to Work with People You Don't Agree With or Like or Trust, I think is the job of the 21st century. We basically solved that problem by war. And I think if one is optimistic going forward, it's that we acquire the emotional literacy to bring love to power and to make power part of love. This is the challenge I see right now, and probably for the next 100 years. Little break. And I'm happy to carry on, Jalia, if that fits the program.
I think so, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So the last point for me was something that really grew in importance. When I studied psychology, I was amazed at how little I knew about human beings. And we had to study psychopathology in 3-hour classes and write long exams about it. And it was basically the study of what's wrong with people. And it's a heavy thing to get into. You would finish a lecture on some diagnosis, and you couldn't even talk to your friends. You just felt so overwhelmed by that view of a human being. And so I became increasingly interested in alternatives to that. And a lot has happened in the last 25 years around positive emotions. William James, who was a great philosopher and physician, I think is a key figure in this story. He said the greatest revolution in our generation is the discovery that human beings, by changing the inner attitudes of their minds, can change the outer aspects of their lives. And he's not speaking here as some kind of mystic or religious figure. He's not a poet. He's a scientist. And so I think he laid down a challenge that's now been taken up. And I want to talk a little bit here about 4 words 4 positive emotions. The first thing that's really important, this is a conference that was held, as you can see, in 2012, and I came across the videos that were online of the conference, 3 days, you know, maybe 6 hours a day, and I just watched them all. And I was really blown away by the effort being made to be precise about what these words mean. When I studied psychology, compassion really wasn't a word in any book. It wasn't in the textbook. And that's changing. It's changing quite a bit. So the theory here is, let's study what's positive in human beings instead of what's negative in human beings. Because if we're going to sort of teach emotional literacy, we really need to teach those things that bring benefit, that bring positive states. So I've organized these in a particular order: resonance, empathy, compassion, and altruism. And I just want to say that the increase in scientific literature in the last 30 years is dramatic, and it's now over 4,000, it's close to 5,000, you know, peer-reviewed journal experiments where people are trying to understand these, either one or all of these words, and how to develop these as skills. So I've sort of nested them. This is my diagram, just, you know, my imagining, because I'm a visual learner, what if those scientists had been inclined to understand these terms visually, they would have created. So I want to quickly go through them and share these ideas with you. So first, the idea of resonance. Resonance is simply tuning into the other. Tuning into the other. Again, it's across all species. Now, tuning into somebody doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a good outcome, but it's considered the kind of foundation to empathy, compassion, and altruism. The ability to tune into another human being. Carl Rogers, who this quote is from, is a psychologist who passed away a number of years ago, but he's known as a humanist psychologist. And his great gift was listening. And there's videotapes I had seen when I was a student of him working with a client where he would just listen. He had a presence that was incredible. And just the last section here is my key point. It's astonishing how elements which seem insoluble become soluble when someone listens. How confusions which seem irremediable turn into relative, clear flowing streams when one of us is heard. And so if you're fortunate enough to know someone who is a good listener, please spend time with them, maybe even ask them or learn from them, because I think listening is the most extraordinary skill. And I've seen it in studio, in an elective I've taught, we actually spend time practicing listening. And one year, I just asked students after a listening experience for feedback, and a student said, I'll just make up the name, Martha, you know, she's the most amazing listener. And it's so important, so important. So my image of listening is simply, you know, the hearing drops into the body. In particular, it drops right into the heart. You're not listening to make a comment. Listening is not trying to get something. It's tuning in. And so one of the things that I've found valuable is that if you listen to others, you'll be better at listening to yourself. You'll be more attuned to the genuine voice within yourself. So again, we're not yet at a place as a culture where we're teaching this, but we can learn from one another and we can practice with one another. I think it's an essential skill. So that just gets us out of grade one, stage one, the foundation resonance, move us into empathy. With empathy, we know the feeling of the other. We have our mirror neurons working, and we have enough self-knowledge, enough confidence really to trust what we're experiencing. So the person you're talking to may not even have to tell you their emotion, you can understand it. Empathy is knowing the feeling of the other. And again, this is across generations, across cultures, across events. It's in the classroom, it's in the home, it's in your relationships. You know, ultimately, the reason having coffee with someone is so satisfying is you get to share something of this experience of empathy. So, you know, again, scientists are breaking these things down. And here are the two major elements, according to this particular scientist. The first is cognitive, which means the thinking. That's the understanding the other's feeling and the ability to take their perspective, to be in their shoes, to not laugh, you know, at the wrong moment. The ability to take their perspective. Second, the affective, and that means the feeling component. When you're listening to somebody, there's an experience we would use in psychology, which is called mirroring, where you actually consciously are showing the concern, if it's appropriate, or the joy, if it's appropriate, of your partner, of your comrade, of your companion. So in my experience studying psychology, they would put a camera on myself in training as a therapist and on another colleague who was role-playing a particular pathology, anxiety, say, or depression. And they were looking to see if you could mirror their emotional state. And to be honest, you know, when I began, I really didn't have much skill in the area. I still don't consider myself that great at it. But if you meet someone who's good at it, you definitely enjoy their company. Listening to somebody really will make you very popular. Again, back to Brené Brown, empathy has no script. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's simply listening. Holding a space without holding judgment. Emotionally connecting and communicating that incredible healing message. You're not alone. And this is a really, I think, important point too, as we go through a non-studio experience. Often, you know, if you're suffering, you can think, I'm suffering, but many people are suffering. It's not easy for anyone. You're not alone. And so as we gain the confidence to, I think, share our experiences and be vulnerable, we find we're less alone. I'm not saying you share that inappropriately with someone. I'm saying you have obviously to have a friend or colleague who you trust, but it's an incredibly valuable relationship if you have a person like that in your life. So we're still at the level of empathy. Empathy is not compassion, however you can turn it into compassion. So this is why I wanted to go through these in a kind of graduated way. So in other words, walking by someone like this is always painful. We feel that pain, but we're not yet taking action. And as a society, you know, it's been a difficult issue. Again, my perspective is the issues of the society come from the individual. So now we're going to lean into the idea of compassion according to these scientists who have investigated the topic. So they speak of three elements: noticing the other suffering, So that's the tuning in, empathically feeling the person's pain, and then acting to ease the suffering. None of these are necessarily easy, and the notion here and the unpacking of this has to do with the idea of actually studying compassion, just the way we would study structures, or where should the, where's the vapor barrier, or we have an opportunity to study this. And I think it's an important component of taking on in a way, one's growth as a human being. Darwin again, compassion is of high importance to all animals which aid and defend one another. Again, increased through natural selection, because those that have the greatest number of compassionate members are going to rear the greatest number of offspring. They're going to care about one another. They're going to thrive. So of course, he's looking at it far more biologically, say, than we would. But look at the posture. Look at this body language. So I'm inspired by the universality of the emotional world. Suffering is suffering. It doesn't matter the continent you've come from. We have far more in common with one another than differences. When it comes to the issue of mental health, far more in common. This is my experience. There are differences, but they're relatively secondary. Darwin points out that we may feel compelled to relieve suffering because it actually takes away our painful feelings. And I don't see any problem in that. The ego may say to us, I can't stand it. I'm going to help that person because I can't stand seeing them suffer. But I think that's a great starting point. So within the family of compassionate action, in that conference, they spoke about 4 streams, if you will. We'll quickly touch base with them. So familial compassion, of course, new life depends on compassion and love. It almost doesn't bear repeating. We all owe our lives to the love of our mother or parents or caregivers. So this is our introduction to compassion. But somehow it's seen on all kinds of scales. For instance, someone decides that they're going to help someone they don't know. Or, you take on a project for people you've never met. How does one explain this in a human being? What are they getting out of this? So from the point of view of looking at these 4 positive emotions, we're seeing that compassion can be exercised, if you will, across a whole range of activities. Heroic compassion, this is the compassion that just compels you to drop what you're doing and help somebody, to not even think of your own welfare. And I'm not saying this is a state to be in all the time, but we seem to be wired for it. There's always the one good news story about someone jumping in a raging river and rescuing somebody. And then finally, sentient compassion. The effort that's gone into rescuing species, helping animals, and even more broadly, I think, we see this, in the creation of parks and, a move in society. I understand there are forces waging against us, but think of a culture, think of a society that's grown to the point where it can actually save habitats. It took us a long time to do this. And this is a form of compassion. So finally, we come to altruism, which is sort of the Olympic level, I would say, the most difficult level. This is a deed for which you will not be rewarded. and you're not motivated to get rewarded. The helping a stranger push a car out of a snowbank, you know, it's defined as not self-sacrifice, but a willingness to act in the consideration of the interests of the other persons without the need of an ulterior motive. And I recommend, you know, adding to your reading list books about people who are altruistic. I have found it to be extremely helpful in understanding what's on my plate. And so I'm just picking 4 figures here, but there's no end to them in society. They're not typically on television, but they exist. And if the topic interests you, I think you'd be rewarded by looking at them more closely and studying their lives, really studying their lives. So this completes these 4 positive emotions. And the doctor who organized this conference at Stanford and runs a research group there investigating these further had the following to say: all crises, personal, social, global, ecological, are problems of the human heart. The chain of causation that has resulted in catastrophes, global warming, poverty, war, they're not external events, external to ourselves. I submit to you they are problems of the human heart. You know, I think it's an interesting perspective because it means you're empowered always. You don't have to be owned by the problem. You can own the problem by seeing your relationship to it. And this is why, you know, the On Empathy platform, at least through my eyes, was such a revolutionary idea and a kind of a radical challenge to the canon that we're all talking about these days. The canon I'm interested in is one's own canon, that part of oneself that doesn't change or doesn't yield or doesn't listen to the other. This is within us, not just outside of us. So back to conscious suffering, accepting where we are is the beginning of change. And I think it's an empowering condition. It's a painful step. But as I said before, I think it opens the door to really a wonderful experience. So this is the summary at the end of this conference. Just going to highlight the bottom paragraph where he says, in a number of studies using a variety of psychological and biological measures and neuroimaging techniques, in other words, studying the brain, compassion not only stimulates one's pleasure center, but leads to a decrease in stress and an increase in adaptive immune function. So even if you were to disregard this emotionally, those types of actions that are positive will be good for your health. And this is not me, you know, talking. This is hard science. These are repeated evidence-based studies. So when I think of where we are now in the 21st century, you know, where power and love have, you know, we've had war after war, conflict after conflict, you know, what could these positive emotions be of use for if we wanted to think differently? Well, there was an interesting thing that happened. For the first time, the United Nations has been doing a World Happiness Report for some time, but they actually invited some neuroscientists in 2015 because these evidence-based studies were becoming widespread. So the following was presented: well-being has been found to be elevated when individuals are better able to sustain positive emotion, that's like resilience, recover more quickly from negative experiences, engage in empathic and altruistic acts, express high levels of mindfulness, or have the capacity to be concentrated when necessary. All of these were found to be elevated when people reported happiness. So my hope is that these types of activities become very central to the educational process long before university, long before university. And the beautiful thing in this work is that these are considered skills that can be enhanced through training. So empathy is a skill, listening is a skill, being compassionate is a skill, and we can actually train ourselves to upgrade, if you will, our neural circuitry and become more loving human beings. So let me just touch base on some tools, resources, and practices, very simple things. This is at Stanford University. They've built a meditation center on campus. Very practically, I would say that journaling is an extremely helpful activity if one is under stress or one is in a circumstance where, you know, whether it's not sleeping well or chronic, you know, discomfort of one kind or another, journaling is something I'd really recommend, because a lot of ruminating thought will get captured. And if you're thinking something and you repeatedly write it down, you end up stop having those thoughts. So just on a level of not say, well, you know, you're just feeling great stress or anxiety or worry, I would really recommend journaling. Eventually, you'll run out of that particular emotion. It will quiet itself. You'll get tired of writing that problem down, and something will shift. In my own experience, I've you know, found myself journaling really most of my life. And the thing that I found wonderful over time is eventually, you know, you might be worried about something, but at the end of writing about that, there'll be some shift. And in my case, you know, if I'm worried, eventually I get to a place of gratitude where I've really come to see that, for instance, gratitude is an amazing antidote to worrying. And somehow one can keep this process alive in oneself of trying to be conscious of what one's going through. So whether it's at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, it's a way of being mindful of the experience you've had that day. Where were you grateful? Where was there compassion? Where were you bullied? You know, how did you handle it? This is the beginning of self-examination. The other thing, of course, you know, that's wonderful is to be part of something larger than yourself. And so, you know, we're fortunate to live in a country here that has, you know, a remarkable landscape and ecosystem. And I can't say how beneficial this is for people to spend time in. And again, in my case, I find that I do a lot of my creative work just in places like this. Just being part of something larger than myself seems to open us up to greater things. Finally, mindfulness training, which has really been an important shift that's come over the area of wellness. The fellow on the right there is Richard Davidson, a professor at University of Wisconsin. He took on the mission, really, of putting into MRIs people who were experienced meditators and people who had no experienced meditation. And he would, you know, an example of an experiment would be putting someone in an MRI machine where you're going to watch their brain, and they would be equipped with a small iPad where they would see a scene which would either make them would make the typical person very uncomfortable, something quite unpleasant. And so they would see the brain light up in that area which is associated with unpleasant emotions. And then they would count how long it took for the brain to come back to its normal resting place. And they found that people who had trained in mindfulness were almost instantly back in a kind of centered place. And those that even after 8 weeks of training returned far swifter than those who had no training. So the evidence seems to be that there's some benefit in mindfulness training. And I'm not saying this is everybody's approach. I'm just saying that if you have an interest in taking on the idea that positive emotions can be cultivated and there's a training process, this may be something of interest to you. We're not talking about going to live, in a cave for years. We're talking about minutes a day yielding positive outcomes. So in interviews with Richard Davidson, what traits are changed? It's not the question, how is it helpful? What traits are changed? Well, there's evidence that there's greater equanimity, which is more resilience, more pro-social behavior in relationship to oneself. So kindness seems to increase, as does compassion. And the lower point here about the self-narrative means that if you're one of those people that, can be self-critical, and I think we're all at points in our lives very self-critical. Even the word, to have a crit bothers me because it has this word critical, but it seems that mindfulness reduces that self-narrative, the ability to change one's relationship to the self, particularly self-narrative. In other words, you'd hear a critical thought and you'd be able to meet it and release it. So if this interests you, you could go to a website like this where Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's basically brought this practice into the medical profession, the mental health profession. Every hospital in Toronto has mindfulness practices. There's ongoing classes and examples where you could tune in even for a few minutes a day if you care to. And then finally, I just want to talk about self-care, which seems to me part of self-compassion. We are living through a difficult time. It's taken away a lot from all of us. And so the idea of, and this might be one of the things we need to learn, and so we may be dealing with this for a while, because we need to learn how important it is to take care of ourselves, to have boundaries where we need them, to both respect others, but respect ourselves. This idea of radical self-care may be one of the kind of benefits that can come out of this very difficult time. So should you have an interest in this, here are some titles for your reflection. And When Things Fall Apart seems like a pretty, who wants to read that book? But things do fall apart from time to time. Why should that not be on our personal curriculum? Heart Advice for Difficult Times. A nun, a Buddhist nun wrote that book. Kristen Neff's book on self-compassion. She's done a number of books, and they're kind of a few that are workbooks where you can kind of walk through them. If you're the kind of person that can be self-critical, it may give you some help. And then Jon Kabat-Zinn, I mentioned him before. I enjoyed reading that book quite a bit because it's a quote from Kazantzakis, actually, the Greek author. Someone asks him in this story, how are you doing? He says, I'm living the full catastrophe, meaning, he's got lots of responsibilities. He's got a wife and family. It's the full catastrophe. But this is a book of resources. And then finally, a book called Emotional Awareness, which is a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and Paul Ekman that really unpacks the values of emotions and their impact on our inner life. Paul Ekman is a really interesting fellow. who did a lot of work based on the work of Darwin and the universality of emotions. So I'd like to do, if we have another few minutes, an empathy experiment. It's a 20-second experiment. You can opt out. You could just, take a break. But this is a 20-second empathy experiment. And I'm going to explain it, and then I'll just direct you through it. Feel free to, as I said, opt out. What I'd like to propose, and we're only going to do this for 20 seconds, but I'd like to propose as an empathy experiment that over the next period of time, maybe until we're back in the school, that 3 times a day for 20 seconds, we visualize, we imagine, we create an image of students being happy and successful. In other words, classmates. If you've graduated, it could still be classmates, or it could be other people in your life. So maybe when you brush your teeth in the morning, and when you brush your teeth in the evening, and one time in between, you just for a moment see people happy that you know. The reason I'm angling this at students is not because potentially there are students here, but when you watch the pressure that students feel to do well, it's very easy to think I must do well. But my point would be, there's room for all students to do well. Everyone wants to do well. And so I think you tap into a greater resource by wishing all students are well, because then the chances are it's just not you wishing yourself well, others will wish you well. So this is how I'd like to do this 20-second guided imagery. I'm just going to, I'll just describe it, then we'll do it. The idea is to just sit comfortably. Whatever you're sitting on is perfect. If you're resting in bed, or if you're in a chair or sofa, on the floor, it doesn't matter. And I'm just going to suggest that you take a moment to focus on your breathing, and then we choose the breath just because it's always with us. You don't have to buy it on Amazon. You don't have to subscribe. You've got it. It's a perfect partner when it comes to mindfulness. And then we'll just take a few breaths, and then I'll ask you to imagine happy students. By happy, I don't mean fake. I mean, you've all, I'm sure at one time or another, seen your colleagues well, seen them happy. They had a good day. They told a great joke. They enjoyed music. Just see them happy. The same part of your brain that sees them happy, that imagination, is the same thing you use to design and create. There's no difference. When you're designing something, some people can see the space, they can imagine it, they get a sense of it. So I feel as designers, we've already got some advantages because we spend our time creating things. I'm suggesting you create a thought, and that thought is, may all students be happy and successful. So I'm going to try this for 20 seconds. The way to begin is your eyes can be open or closed. And you just, without any effort, just bring your awareness to your breathing. And you're breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, just let the surface your body is resting on do the work. Breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, just letting go. We just need to make a shift. We don't have to go from 10 to 3. We need to go from 10 to 9.79. So that little shift, breathing in, breathing out. Take a moment now to imagine a colleague, a friend, a partner, a favorite animal. See them happy. Breathing in, breathing out. May all students be happy and successful. Just imagine it, get a sense of it. Good. And just let yourself soften, breathing in, breathing out. May all students be happy and successful. Great. That's my little experiment. If you have interest, see if you can do it for a period of time and see if it actually has some of the outcomes that are predicted by science. The exciting thing for me about these experiments, and particularly the ones being done by people like Richard Davidson, is these are not religious positions. These are not coming from the world's religions, even though they have a similar message. These are scientific investigations of positive emotion. So sorry, I've gone on here. I have one quick section to go, and I think I'll finish with that section, and then we can stop for questions. Is that okay, Jalia? Just going quickly here, I just wanted to end with something about creative life, because, you know, even at the start of the studio I'm teaching now, I said to myself, how can we even get into a creative position in the midst of this catastrophe? How can we do this? And what helped me was just thinking about the power and the necessary power of the creative life. As Jung says, I sleep and my soul awakens. Imagination is the star within humankind. I think as creative people, we take for granted how important creativity is, not just for our own fulfillment. You know, I'll just quickly describe why this is here. You know, this is a 3,500-year-old object. And it's basically an explanation of how the sun gets across the sky. It's pulled by a horse. It's being pulled as though it's a chariot. In other words, someone in that society took an extremely complex and unknown thing, a thing they didn't know how to kind of describe, and made it into something. And I feel that's something that we have to take on. That's, if one chooses to go into this field, that this is one of the things that we do on behalf of our community and our democracy, actually. So Edinger, who's a Jungian therapist whose work I admire, he said, artistic creations perform for society much the same function as dreams perform for the individual. They are the mirror that reveals to us what we are really like. So, you know, if you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to wrap this gigantic building, you know, they'll think you're mad. But if you stick with it for 20 years, something happens. And, you know, all of a sudden, 6 million people over the course of, you know, several months have to come here because something important, something society couldn't understand is being revealed. The other thing that you know, I feel inspires us at this time is that we're desperately needed. The world is designed. We have to advance this enterprise. You know, these decisions are becoming more and more critical. So I took from that the idea that, you know, this could be a very important outcome of what's going on. We may not be back to business as usual for some time, but business as usual was very destructive. And so maybe one of the things we can do while we're going through this is to think about the world that we want to be in on the other side of this. This is the world we're going to be designing. I give this Patricia Moore as evidence of a remarkable idea about creativity. Some of you probably know of her. She was an industrial designer. In the 70s, when she graduated, age 26, she dressed up as an 85-year-old woman off and on for 3 years. And her goal was to find out what it was like to be in a society that didn't really have a concern for elders. So she stayed with this and then took on, as a result of this, a significant role in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed as law. So to me, this is one of the most, wonderful examples, a kind of design altruism, if you will, certainly compassion, where she put herself into the world, saw it through sort of in the eyes of others, and made a big change. Of course, everyone is equal in our society. We have to see the world through everyone's eyes. And her work now is to work with veterans in the United States. So to me, a kind of design hero. And then Dan Gelbart, who's done a lot of work on happiness, actually, in the study of happiness, talks about the human brain in a way that I think as designers is very congruent with what we do. The greatest achievement of the human brain is its ability to imagine objects and episodes that do not exist in the realm of the real, and is this ability that allows us to think about the future. So this is what we're doing as designers. And when I ask you to visualize your classmates happy, this is also what we're doing. It's something in the future. And as one philosopher noted, making future is one of the most important things the brain does. It's an anticipation machine. So I feel, and I've always felt, that designers have a great advantage in taking on compassionate acts because we can imagine things. And our job is to actually bring them into the world. So finally, you can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have. This is so true. And I think it speaks to a kind of surprising benefit of being creative. And that is you become generous, naturally generous. And so I urge you to share your creative abilities, in kind of perhaps obvious and less obvious ways as you go through the long experience of being an architect. So if this interests you, a couple of books to look at. Kevin Ashton's book is all about iteration, really. It's an incredible study of the idea of the iterative process. Women Run with Wolves is now a bit old, but I think it's an important book because I think women's creativity has not been put in front of us adequately. And I think we need more voices and more strong guidance about the path of women who are creative. And Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who's a Jungian analyst, I think was one of the first to penetrate this world. And I think it's an important book. Steve Johnson's book is more like stories of innovation and the kind of synchronicities of inner and outer experience that go into creativity. And then finally, Anders Ericsson's book is all about practice. And he's the scientist who came up with the idea of 10,000 hours, which was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, but he's the psychologist who studied practices and the kind of point of developing, and this is studied on the level of brains, what happens to the brain through repeated circuitry, the repetition of actions and thoughts over time. So thank you very much. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you, Jalia. Any questions? I'm happy to hang out and look at them. Comments?
Thanks, Andrew. Just going through the chat box here, and Jennifer Chen had a comment. Jennifer, do you want to read that, or do you want me to read it?
Hi, sorry, I'm just unmuting myself. So less of a question and more of a reflection. Like, I'm trying to understand what, it's been a thing that I've been wondering about, what it means to be with your emotions as opposed to ignoring them or obsessing about them. And I wanted to reflect on my experience in the last term, and just very recently realizing that being alone does have a legitimate impact on my emotional state, even if I don't notice it most of the time. Even if it was really, really unnoticeable. And I think I've even like gone through like a pretty burnt out week. However, this has been more of a recognition of it, and I still have yet to know how to like, be with the emotions. Do I just like dedicate more hours to meditation? Do I have to fit in yoga in my schedule? Do I have to like give up social media? I'm not sure.
Wow, that's great. Thanks for that question. Well, first of all, I think we're all burned out. It's really difficult times. I think everybody has their own way of self-care. You mentioned yoga, you mentioned, online activities. I think you're brave to mention those kinds of things, because if you can start testing, I'm just saying very practically, I would begin testing what brings benefit. It's a strange thing. As we get to know ourselves, we have to accept ourselves. So you may find that everyone you know is doing one thing, and it may not be helpful for you, and you might have to do something different. They might be, enjoying one kind of online activity. It may not be for you. So, just speaking broadly, and of course, I'm just making a kind of general comment. I think you've opened a door, and I would go through it and say, I'm recognizing that I'm burned out. What are the things I might try changing? Is that diet? Is that yoga? Is that who I talk to? Is it just the end of term? And I'm always burned out at the end of term. You're getting to know yourself. So for me, it's a kind of victory in that you're using your time wisely. I'll just share with you, I'm burned out also. It's been much more challenging than I thought. That's what I mean about we're social animals. How do we get our cup filled in this situation? But it sounds to me like you're self-aware enough to begin looking into that question. And it's really not for me to say this is the answer. I would say I want to encourage you to take seriously your insight. I'm burned out. And in my experience, if you do that, the next time you're under these stresses, they'll be less. And you'll be able to help others through your experience. So, I think it's a really valuable question. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you. So they basically just try to answer your own question, basically.
Well, I mean, listen, there's more, if you need to talk to a counselor, of course, talk to a counselor. I don't mean to eliminate the
Oh, no. Yeah.
No, but I mean, tune into yourself, maybe keep a journal and begin to record what refreshes you, what's refreshing, what lifts your spirit, move towards things that refresh you.
Okay.
It's a challenge. Even people who have, gone through all kinds of things are challenged right now. The people I know that I consider resilient are challenged right now. It's just the way it is. But I think you're onto it by taking seriously your experience.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a question from Emma. Emma, would you like to read the question? Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I just wrote that the biggest loss that I've noticed in the quarantine is that we no longer have the sort of incidental social interaction that we used to have, and that was characterized by the studio. And you know, I was thinking about your comments on active listening and how we're able to practice that well when we're in an environment where every social interaction has to be very, very deliberate. Like, you know, how do we sort of know what's going on in each other's lives? I don't know.
Sorry, do you mean like colleagues that are also online? Is that what you're referring to? Like, how do we know? Is that what you mean?
Just being able to tune into our immediate peers that
Right.
that we used to share the physical space with.
Who you used to share space with? Is that what you? Sorry. Yeah. You know, it sounds a bit awkward, but I don't think it would be, for me anyway. I mean, it could be something like just asking, you know, would there be a group of people who want to just share their experience of the week? So no one's forced. It's completely an open circle. And the circle is dedicated to listening. And see what happens. The reason I say kind of create the invitation is that, you know, maybe you can bring together the people who share the sense of difficulty you experience. And it's not a top-down thing. We're trying to change the dynamic. See, it's a little, I sometimes feel a bit awkward because when I studied psychology, everybody seems to be good at, to some degree, in listening and tuning in. And, you know, I once had an experience when I was an intern where I had a client who got enraged about something. It was quite terrifying. And he stormed out. I mean, he really stormed out. And I was sitting there alone, and within 2 minutes, 4 or 5 people came in and checked on me. Are you okay? What happened? You know? And you know, I've heard people work in architects' offices where there is comradeship and there is concern about the other. And I've heard people work in firms where it's quite, you know, difficult to generate that experience. So it comes to me that it might be helpful to just kind of establish that you're wondering if others would like to join you, and you can see what happens. Listening. Listening is, I don't know, do you consider yourself a good listener?
I hope so.
Well, you know, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I was thinking about going into the quarantine too, that, you know, this idea that, you know, we will have to be a lot more deliberate about reaching out to each other and making sure that we stay involved in each other's lives and whatnot, which was a little, which can be tough for me sometimes. I find that I tend to get very inundated with guilt that I'm somehow bothering or pestering somebody when I ask to reach out, and I'm trying to sort of reframe that in different ways, like that, you know, people might be perfectly happy to hear from me, and I don't know either way, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, you know, maybe it's a subset of the empathy group where there's just a kind of listening circle. And you know, the idea of study is important. You could study listening. You know, musicians are good listeners in terms of music. And occasionally you meet people who are just good listeners. And you could begin to study what that means. I met once someone who was an incredible listener, and every time I spoke with her, I just never wanted to leave. It was so incredible. I didn't know what was going on.
Maybe we could open up. Oh, we have another question. Brenda, would you like to read your question? Maybe we can just open it up so that we can just ask the questions.
Sure. It's not really a question, but I think in terms of this big loss that we're talking about, I noticed at first, and then I've been like actively looking for small signs of community and care. And as Emma was just mentioning, these require these like deliberate participation rather than kind of this casual participation. It doesn't require much effort or sacrifice on our own parts. And I think this is so interesting and yet so difficult and hopefully really transformative about this time. Is this attention that we have to bring, and this awareness that we need community, and then that's an active participation on an individual level and a group level.
Yeah, true. It's going to be interesting to see what happens as we go on. Are you able to feel a sense of fulfillment through what your observations are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really transformed my entire thesis, which I started looking at, care and what the role of the architect is, and then I had no idea that this situation was going to evolve, and it really brought the issue of care to the center and thinking about how we even create community in this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Andrew, I had a question about guilt. I heard that word being used. I think it maybe Emma had mentioned it. And I was just thinking that, it feels like because of so many different types of things going on in the world, there's a sort of shared guilt to not be part of that or part of the solution or actively part of the change. And I was always wondering about that. How do you deal with guilt, like sort of collective guilt or an individual guilt?
Do you mean feeling guilty because you're, I think, did I hear you say you feel guilty because you're not part of the change?
Not feeling part of the change, not feeling like, you're contributing enough.
Oh. Not contributing enough to the change, like not doing enough online or in person to change the world, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, there's so many things happening.
Right.
And I think being online, especially, we're exposed to that. And there's a feeling that, maybe, here I am in my apartment, am I doing enough? And I think there's a sense of guilt that comes with that.
Can I add something to Jalia's question?
Sure.
I think a part of that is also survivor's guilt. I mean, I think we feel it in different ways, but as an example of a easy one, when the Ukrainian flight went down, I knew people on that flight. And it could have easily been me. So I think it's not just a matter of not doing enough, but it's also a matter of not being the victim and feeling guilty for just by pure chance being the okay one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I find myself in circumstances like that, circling back to, you know, asking myself, not just the question, what can I do for everybody? What can I do for the greater condition? But how can I be more loving and honest with myself and the people around me? I have, I think we begin with ourselves. I think I have far more confidence in people taking on themselves than trying to take on others. So I'm not saying that the world doesn't need our attention, but I think we need, I think it begins with a self-care, a place of self-care, because otherwise you may be helping from a place of, you know, where you don't have actually anything to give, or you feel coerced, or, you know, the word guilt was used. So, you know, my own approach there is to return to my sense of self in a way. And I don't mean that in a selfish sense. I mean a self in terms of being connected to what's true for me. You know, if one is grieving or going through something, you know, of like real emotional turmoil, yeah, I mean, maybe one has to reach out and get support for that. But you could easily spend your day just reading about the global catastrophe. And you know, I'm not, from my perspective, that would be a kind of burnout also. So we're all, even though we may not be in studio, we're surrounded by people. We have others around us. We can practice all the things we're talking about on a very local level. And I think that has enormous impact. You know, these are unusual times, I think, very unusual times. And some of the things that are in front of us right now are not going to change overnight. You know, even though we shine a big light on them, this is going to take time. But I'm personally convinced that things will go and be accelerated because of this. But I can't wake up every day in a kind of deficit. I would be of no value to anyone. So my position is, you know, begin with self-care. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
If I
Thank you.
add something to it, what? Sorry, I was just gonna say I agree with you. And as a person who's been struggling with a lot of these even before COVID, it's been a rough year for a lot of Iranians. I think there's this tendency to see self-care as just doing yoga and being vegan and like meditating, which are great things. I practice yoga myself, but I think self-care can also be like painting your nails and watching a comedy movie and going out with your friends and having a glass of wine. So, I mean, socially distanced glass of wine. So I think this just to remind people to like have fun and to laugh is okay.
Oh, necessary. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, yeah. To enjoy life, you know, there are going to be ups and downs, but to enjoy life, I think that's a skill. You know, again, you know, some of this comes back to the idea of gratitude. You know, when you're standing in line to buy a coffee and the line's going slowly, you know, try just being grateful that someone picked those beans for you. Someone raised a cow. Someone designed an espresso machine. I mean, you're riding a huge wave of accomplishment. Can I have a coffee, please? I mean, we are so fortunate here. It's extraordinary. We take it all for granted. So from my position, you know, all these things we're enjoying, we had nothing to do with. The coffee, the cell phone, 5G, 4G, unlimited internet. Who knows anything, you know, who's done that? Did you make your shoes? What about the building you're in? Did you make it? You know? So I just see us as riding this enormous effort of society to improve things. And it's not as fast as we would like, but it's a huge accomplishment we rest on every day. Yes, it's difficult right now, and you know, that can't be ignored, but we've accomplished a lot. Even to have a school where there is a studio when time's permitted. I mean, what an accomplishment of civilization. You know, that's really took a long time to create studio. Never mind AutoCAD. So, you know, gratitude is fantastic medicine in these times. And I think it's an extremely wonderful antidote to worry. You know, just look around you. You know, we're just so fortunate.
I have a follow-up question about gratitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been kind of familiar with the idea of gratitude, and that we do live in a wonderful, fortunate world in many aspects. It's both like wonderful and terrifying at the same time. But like lately, given like I've been thinking a lot about privilege, and like, for example, how do I feel gratitude for the suburban house when I know it's part of like a really environmentally destructive practice, when I know that it was stolen by indigenous people? How do I feel comfortable living in like a suburban neighborhood when I know that it was created, when I'm effectively living in a bubble? Like I find it's like I'm not too sure like how to feel gratitude for what I have in the context of like becoming aware of all these societal issues.
Well, first of all, is that where you're living right now?
I live in the suburbs, right?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, it could be worse. There are worse places to be. But here's the thing, you're at the beginning of your adulthood. And what you'll be able to do is not live in that house forever. You're going to have a choice about where you live. And so my view on that type of issue is you're preparing yourself to make a decision about where you will live, about your relationships to other groups, and how you'll honor your beliefs. So that's what I meant about a rite of passage. You know, life escalates in difficulty. So you think you're busy now with what's on your plate, but 10 years from now, you know, you might be running something, and there may be a family, and there may be more, you know, who knows what that looks like. And you'll have the chance to make decisions. So right now, you know, you can see certain injustices and so forth. I still think that you're fortunate to be there, given all the places one can live, but I don't deny your observations. But over the next 10 years, you know, what would be great is, you know, to have a conversation in 10 years and see where you're living.
Sounds good. Yeah, I just gotta remember to do that. To remember to that. Something I've been realizing is that I might not be in the best position to actually do the change that I'm demanding myself to be, because I actually realize there's so much more to learn. So the last term has really been learning about what I don't know and learning the importance of listening before I act, and knowing that I'll get there eventually and having that patience.
The best thing in the world is to be a student. You can learn from everything, everyone. Like I said, the challenges increase. After you get through the trauma of grade 1, you have to go to grade 2. After you get through the trauma of undergraduate, you go to graduate, and then what? It's not like the challenges stop. That's why we talk about resilience. Like you're gonna have a choice to make. Do you want more responsibilities or not? And that's coming.
Yeah.
And as you acquire those, you actually have your influence will grow.
So like the challenges won't stop, but you'll learn from each one you've had before.
Yeah,
take on the next.
That's the whole point. We're not here to actually own a Mercedes. And I hope you get one if they have cars, 20 years from now. But we're actually here to grow as human beings. It's not in the curriculum. That's the problem. The curriculum's upside down. It's important that you're able to earn a living and be of benefit to the community, but as a human being, where do we get our education? So I think that's what I'm hoping comes out of this, that we take on the education of the heart of the whole human being, not just the intellect, which is important. We need intelligence, but it can't be drifting from our emotional life. It has to be connected. Power needs love, love needs power. That's our school.
Hi, Andrew. I just wanted to, since you started to talk about education, I wanted to quickly address that. And I took this Shakespeare course in the beginning of the term where they just changed the curriculum completely to reflect on the pandemic. And we studied all this, at least 3 or 4 Shakespeare plays through the eyes of someone suffering a pandemic, which really helped me make sense of the new world that we are starting to adapt to now. I wonder, since you are talking about changes to the educational system, will this gentler philosophy ever enter the educational system in our architectural department?
Of course it will. Of course it will. It's already, if you go back 50 years, there's been dramatic change. And it's not just the architectural curriculum, it's grade 1. Certain things come to you at certain points in your life. The experience of being 13 is different than 19, is different than 24. And we need to have an appropriate educational experience. So I'm really glad it sounds like that Shakespearean course was fantastic. That's a very creative thing to have done. I think it's wonderful. But there's no doubt in my mind that this is going to happen. It's in motion, it's happening. It's a big project, but I have no doubt. I really have no doubt. It used to be much worse. Much worse. People, and just to speak about architecture school, not that architecture school is important on the level we're talking about in one way, but I know people who were so traumatized by crits when they were students. This was some time ago. People were really treated horribly. Way worse than anything you see today. Way worse. It was a free-for-all.
I heard stories from Rick.
Yeah, okay, so the point is we're working on it. And I don't mean we, the institution, I mean we as human beings. Everything's going through this right now. So I just happen to believe that education would be the quickest way to change everything. But it's not to say there's not other initiatives that are very important, and there are. But we are changing things. It's a big project. What's your favorite Shakespeare play?
I really like Merchant of Venice. Since grade 9, I've loved Merchant of Venice.
Why?
Just Shylock. I love the character of Shylock.
What do you like about him?
If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you poison us, do we not die? That it just changed a lot of things in my mind. Or it was just the drama with which it happened, the overtly exaggerated drama.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, don't stop. Keep going.
Trying to.
Yeah, it's great.
The studio is pretty heavy. The 4B studio.
Yeah.
It's difficult to not have any compatriots to nod to while we're at it.
Yeah, we're gonna examine everything. It's been a challenge, and we're gonna get better at it. Just everything's gonna. I think everything's gonna be examined through this experience we're going through, and we needed it. I don't say we need illness, but we need it to be to examine things. So it seems that that's what's going to happen. But I'm glad you found Shakespeare. It's great.
Okay, we're at 8 o'clock. Maybe I could just ask one more time if there's any more questions, and then we can start to wrap up.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So Victor and I was kind of thinking about how this experience in quarantine rivals, other experiences that people may have had in the past as a result of whatever circumstances that have resulted in solitary confinement. And how solitary confinement as an experience of asociality kind of requires you to confront yourself fully as your singular social partner, which is something that's kind of difficult to do. We're sort of predicated on grind culture being the main method of socialization, which is to say that we have a working day that's predicated on the notion that work is a means of socialization. And I think that it's foreign for us to even think about the concept of rest as being radical and revolutionary. And so while some of the things that are happening right now are kind of the result of radical unrest and are kind of propagated by that, I think that the true revolution will kind of be upheld and maintained by rational, like revolutionary, radical, rested people. It's something that I've been struggling myself in terms of general chronic insomnia and things that people tend to talk about in architecture school, but are kind of laughed about in a weird way that's kind of like masochistic and not productive. And so I think that it's something that we need to start to divert from our sense of pride, which is to say that the more you grind, the more you do. But I think that we sometimes need to think about how we don't necessarily need to go against the grain all the time, and that perhaps may be detrimental to us. And I think that that's something that I'm learning myself, and that not tying your self-worth to some sort of capitalistic method of understanding that your worth is tied to your productive value is apparently, good for your mental health, and just understanding that things will happen, and sometimes there's no rational reason why, and there's no higher power that sort of deliberates this as a good or a bad thing. And the notion that just shit happens is something that I've kind of tried to accept a little bit more now. Well, I'm still not sleeping that well. I think it's something to consider that the revolution will be maintained by people who are radically rested because one like, absolutely favorite, I guess, activism is called the Nat Ministry, and they have these wonderful pictures of people just resting, being at a state of peace. And I think that's something that I kind of translate to like a good design workflow, which is just getting into a state of flow where ideas come to you naturally. You can spend hours on something, but it doesn't actually feel like work. And I've noticed that sometimes when I've been going against the grain and trying to go with, say, for example, a very strict studio deadline or a very particular rubric, and I've taken that time to say, you know what, I've got these ideas in my head and I just kind of want to explore them. That's when I found that I've actually created the most creative, the most uplifting work that I could ever use. And then it's kind of like, why was I trying to go against my natural instinct when I could have gone along with it the entire time, gotten better sleep, the skin looks better, everything is just better. So, you know, both for your mental health and for your vanity, which contributes to your mental health, because then you look at yourself in the mirror in a much more positive way. It's kind of something that I think is kind of transformative and should be praised more so than the grind culture that exists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. So, you know, that tuning into yourself and what you need and being true to yourself, that's, you know, that's the whole point of getting an education. I know on the surface of it, you have a degree, but the real substance is, you know, teaching yourself how to be true to yourself in spite of what others are doing or saying. Of course, that's the point. So I'm glad you're in that place. And you know, you'll get better at it. You're going to practice and you'll build that muscle up. It's a learning thing. You know, if you take a French class, you know, the first few months, you're not very conversant. 5 years later, you are. So I think you're making good use of your time if you're acquiring that capacity. It's great. It's great. Thanks, Victor.
You're welcome.
Okay, maybe we can wrap up and leave it at that point. Thank you so much for joining in this evening, everyone. Very grateful to have all of you here. And thank you, Andrew, for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invite, Jalia, and thanks everybody who joined in this evening. It's always an honor to be part of the empathy group. Really appreciate it.
Anyone who's interested, I've posted the link to the YouTube channel for On Empathy. We're posting our talks there. The last one is up. Feel free to go watch it and comment and share and all the subscribe and all the stuff people do on YouTube.
Thanks, Benise. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a good weekend.